this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Mark Twain wrote, "There's something fascinating about science. One gets such wholesale returns of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact." In this video, we're going to look at a couple of examples of scientists coming to wrong conclusions because they didn't have the right information. Over and over again, the press reports that today's wildfires are hotter and more destructive. Scientists say they're even creating their own weather systems, making winds more erratic and the conditions too dangerous for firefighters to even try to protect homes. These are called megafires. They're becoming more and more common. To examine this theory, let's go back in time 150 years. On October 7, 1871, the prairies of Minnesota were on fire for 150 miles. Men, women, and children were fleeing for their lives. Several towns destroyed, great damage occasioned, loss of life. The Great Prairie Fire is still raging with unabated fury. On the same date in 1871, the Chicago Tribune reported continuance of the destructive fires in Wisconsin and Minnesota. The fires covered much of the state of Minnesota and were being driven forward by very high winds. Conditions were bad on October 7, 1871, but the next day they got much worse. On October 8, 1871, Chicago burned to the ground. The Chicago Tribune reported that 18,000 buildings were destroyed in the fire. Chicago was a massive inferno on October 8, 1871. Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Minnesota were on fire, and the Rocky Mountains were in flames as well. But the worst fire wasn't in Chicago. It was in Wisconsin around Green Bay. The town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin was completely destroyed by the fire in just a few minutes. More than 1,000 people died. This is what Peshtigo looked like in September 1871, 1 month before the fire. And this is what Peshtigo looked like after the fire. Everything was destroyed. Besides the 1,000 people who died, 3,000 men, women, and children became destitute. Appalling loss of life. Scores of men maimed for life. Little ones suffering. And of course they had similar problems in Chicago where 18,000 buildings burned to the ground. In a matter of just 1 week, much of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois burned. At Chicago after the fire, Wisconsin and Michigan fires, Peshtigo entirely destroyed, hundreds of dead buried, very many badly burned, an urgent appeal for aid. Chicago and Peshtigo weren't the only cities destroyed. Manistee, Michigan was destroyed. Glen Haven, Michigan was destroyed. And Holland, Michigan was destroyed as well. The fires which occurred this week 150 years ago were much larger and much more destructive than anything we've experienced recently. And here's a description of why the fires were so bad. From 1870 to 1871, the Midwest was engulfed in drought. Peshtigo and the surrounding area, which normally gets a meter or two of snow, got almost none that winter. The spring and summer also brought lighter than normal precipitation. Historical records mark the date of the last soaking rain before the fire as July 8th. There was essentially no precipitation for 3 months before the fire on October 8th. In early October, a cyclonic weather front formed over the Great Plains, creating westerly winds that headed towards Peshtigo. When the storm hit the Northwoods on October 8th, a huge temperature difference created strong winds, kicking up coals and fanning the smaller fires, which merged into one enormous fire. A wall of flame nearly 5 kilometers wide and almost a kilometer high roared through the town and quickly spread, according to survivor accounts. You read that correctly. The wall of fire was almost 1 kilometer or 2/3 of a mile high. Based on the vitrification of sand, the fire was estimated to have reached more than 1,000 degrees Celsius. It burned so intensely that it created its own weather system, with winds whipping the fire into a tornado-like column of fire and cinders. Authors Guess and Lutz reported that winds rushed through the town at more than 160 kilometers per hour. This description of the events of 150 years ago came from Earth magazine. Now let's go back and look at the NPR article again. They say today's wildfires are hotter and more destructive due to climate change. But like many things which NPR reports, the premise of the story is not correct. We've never experienced anything remotely like the fires of 150 years ago, which had flames 1 kilometer high and 160 km/h winds. It's just like Mark Twain said, these climate scientists are getting such wholesale returns of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact. Now let's look at another superstition about the fires this week 150 years ago. There's a popular theory that the massive fires of October 1871 came without warning and they came out of nowhere. Traditionally, the Chicago fire has been blamed on Mrs. O'Leary's cow. And another theory is that the fires were caused by a meteor or a comet crashing into the Great Lakes region. This theory is based on the idea that the people of Chicago and Peshtigo had no idea that anything bad was going on and the fires appeared out of nowhere. But if we look at the historical record from 5 days earlier, we find out that simply isn't true. On October 3rd, 1871, 5 days before the really big fire, it was reported that the people of Peshtigo expected to be driven from the town by the fires. They knew there were very bad fires off to the west. There was smoke everywhere. But 2 years of severe drought and high winds drove the flames 1 kilometer high and they moved along 160 km/h. These fires had nothing to do with carbon dioxide, they had nothing to do with a meteor, and they had nothing to do with Mrs. O'Leary's cow. When scientists are willing to delude themselves and not look into the historical record, they're invariably going to come up with the wrong conclusion. Nothing has changed since the days of Mark Twain. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this sort of junk science for the past 13 years. You can visit him, Curie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.